Welcome to everyone just joining. I think we're going to give it another couple minutes to let some other folks trickle into the room, and then I'll get started. All right, 9:02. I think we can begin. Hi everyone. My name is Annalise Burkhart. I'm here speaking to you today on behalf of the U.S. chapter of Transparency International, which is the world's largest and oldest anti-corruption organization in the world, with chapters in over 100 countries. One quick thing to note before I dive in is that if a question comes to mind while we're speaking, please make use of the Q&A feature down below. With that out of the way, I'm pleased to welcome you to this briefing that we're hosting on the cusp of the IMF and World Bank spring meetings this week here in Washington, D.C. I think this is a really important conversation that we're having right now more than ever, considering the alarmingly high levels of public debt around the world and the fallout of governments grappling with their ability to grow their economies, all while paying off their balances, exacerbated by high interest rates. The UN estimates that currently 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on just paying down their interest than on education or health. And in 2022, developing economies paid $49 billion more to their external creditors than they received in fresh disbursements. The argument that I'm presenting to you today is that continued lending without proper safeguards in place is irresponsible and only serves to worsen the debt trap that so many low to middle income countries have found themselves in. There are a myriad of reasons why so many rounds of past financing have failed to contribute to sustainable and self-reliant economies, but we argue that it's really been corruption, waste, and abuse enabled by poor public financial management and weak governance frameworks in countries. In a previous report, Transparency International US found that countries in or at high risk of debt distress perform worse across governance-related indices. So to achieve the results as outlined in the IMF's mandate, ensuring that financing is used for its intended purpose and accrues to the benefit of country populations, it's imperative that countries curb corruption, build out their anti-money laundering frameworks, and strengthen public financial management, ultimately plugging the loopholes or really floodgates that have impeded meaningful economic progress. These are all things that the IMF has the ability to require governments to do as part of their lending arrangements. The fund has a pretty good toolbox for elevating these types of issues. There are the governance diagnostics, which are in-depth assessments of corruption and governance vulnerabilities across core state functions, tailored to each country and only conducted upon request by the member government, to providing capacity development or expertise provided by IMF staff into crafting best practices and pathways to implementation. So I'm pleased to be joined today by three experts on this subject. Two of them have worked extensively on lending and IMF arrangements in their respective countries, and our third panelist has been leading really critical work into documenting the risks of hidden debt, quite literally debt that's taken on by governments without disclosing it to their people, and solutions for addressing an emerging problem that is definitely not discussed as much as it should be. So our speakers include Daniela Pineros, who leads the Public Resources Program at Transparency International, focusing on shaping policies and advocacy to close corruption loopholes in public fund management. Her work includes safeguarding domestic resource mobilization, particularly by strengthening sovereign debt management and ensuring transparent and accountable public procurement and oversight of public spending. We also have Diana Gichengo, the executive director for the Institute for Social Accountability and the convener of the Okoa Achumi Campaign Coalition, a citizen and civil society platform committed to working with stakeholders to resolve Kenya's public debt crisis. The campaign advocates for balanced and equitable budgets to achieve debt sustainability and economic inclusion, seeking to bolster constitutional safeguards in public debt management and push for political leaders' accountability in public debt management. And last but not least, we're joined by Kashif Ali, the Executive Director of Transparency International Pakistan, where he works on increasing the demand and momentum for effective anti-corruption and social accountability reforms at the national level among key anti-corruption stakeholders in Pakistan. I'm first going to turn it over to Daniela, and then to Kashif, and Diana will follow. I'll then pose a round of questions to each panelist to get the ball rolling, and then we're going to open the floor to you all, our virtual audience. I'm going to try to be a pretty strict moderator, so to our panelists, if one of you starts to run over time, I'll give you a signal. So without further ado, Daniela, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Annalise, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar today. As Annalise was mentioning, my name is Daniela Patiño, and I'm leading our work on public debt and public resources global in Transparency International. As Annalise was mentioning, we are currently facing one of the worst global debt crises we have seen since the records exist in terms of debt. Currently, as Annalise was saying, 40% of the low, middle, and income countries are either at debt distress or facing a high risk of debt distress. What this means is that countries are at the verge of a macroeconomic and fiscal crisis in which they won't be able to pay their future debt. They will have increased interest, they will lose market confidence, and this would also have other types of repercussions on the way in which the macroeconomic stability of the country is. What this means in terms of the life of people is that in most African countries, for example, countries are paying over 30% of their budgets in debt services, in interest to pay their loans and in interest on paying their debt. And this could also increase to almost 50% in several countries in the continent. What it means is that countries are spending, or governments are spending more on paying debt and on financial type of services that what they are doing on critical services such as health and education. And even when they do have the loans, and even when they do have the space to invest on critical infrastructure, we're seeing that without strong anti-corruption, transparency, and accountability provisions, the risk of these resources of being captured, being lost, and being embezzled is quite high. What we are seeing in the current global debt crisis, it has showed us the deep and the intrinsic challenges that we're facing in the international financial architecture as well. And we will be discuss this with Diana, with Kashif, the challenges that we see in domestic accountability governance systems. There are different variables and different elements that have driven the current debt crisis. However, none of them has been as persistent and as non-discussed as it is corruption. In the current financial architecture, we're seeing that there's no way of publicly knowing how much do countries owe, to whom, under which conditions, and under which type of provisions their debt is being negotiated. According to a recent study that was published by the IMF last year, they analyzed different countries' legal frameworks to see which are the provisions to prevent corruption in debt, as well as to promote higher transparency in loans. And they saw that less than 50% of the countries analyzed have a mandate or have specific legal provisions to disclose their debt. And even when they do, most of their debt is centralized around central government loans without including other type of provisions or a specific type of instruments such as debt swaps or even debt that is being loaned by state-owned enterprises. On the other side, we're seeing that on top of this lack of transparency that basically let us know how much do countries owe to whom and under which conditions, there are also very weak accountability provisions. So in many cases, we're seeing that the debt that is being contracted by the countries is not even approved by the parliamentary or overseen by other types of institutions, nonetheless by civil society organizations. And even in the countries in which parliaments have the mandate to oversee or approve the debt, they don't necessarily have the capacity, the interest, or the space to really oversee how these debt negotiations are taking place, under which conditions, and basically guarantee that this would go in the best interest and welfare of the people. In this sense, what we would be recommending from Transparency International, we'll be happy to discuss this further, is that first, we need to close the loopholes that would enable corruption in debt contraction and debt management. As Annalise was saying, one of these tools can be through the development of governance diagnosis, but further than that, we need to recognize what is the link between corruption and unsustainable debt. Corruption is a driver of unsustainable debt, and without specific provisions to disclose how much debt is being owned, under which conditions, how it's being negotiated, and with strong accountability mechanisms that include, of course, strengthening the capacity of parliaments, of supremacy institutions, as well as empowering civil society and citizens to monitor and to oversee how that is being contracted and how these resources are being used to guarantee the welfare not only of the current generation, but also of generations to come. So I'll leave it here for now. I'm happy to discuss further on our recommendations and the debt crisis. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela. It was really informative, and I know that we're going to dive into that a little bit more during our Q&A. And then I think our next speaker, Diana, was it going to be you? Or Kasha first?
I think it was Diana.
All right, Diana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Annalise, and thank you very much, Daniela, for that particular background that you have just painted. In Kenya, we are faced currently with a debt crisis that then is triggering social and an economic crisis because of acquisition of very, very high public debt. And this is the problem is compounded by the fact that we acquire very high debt and we do not utilize it for the intended purposes. So the impact of corruption on debt and even tax revenue has gotten us to what we are calling a socio-economic crisis. And whenever you're in that situation and you have a government that is not entirely responsible, what happens then is that you find yourself in situations that the government goes for all and any credit. We are largely marked as a bad creditor. As a bad creditor, we therefore acquire loans both domestically and on the international front at very, very, very high interest. Definitely being a country in Africa, it doesn't help that our own currency has to be linked with global currencies, and in particular the US dollar. And that base we cannot change, but everything else lies in the hands of our political class, who unfortunately have elected to just neglect that altogether. Last year, the last fiscal year alone, our government took loans amounting to about $8 billion US dollars from the global market and additional loans from the domestic market. These loans have gotten to a point where in our country, our debt to GDP, our legislation currently provides for an anchor where our debt should not exceed 55% of the GDP. But currently, we are at 67%. And because of the debt that is due for maturity between now and the year 2032, so that's 7 consecutive years, even for those who are biblical, Kenya is going to be on a path of 7 lean years with very many and high debt maturities. This year alone, we are looking at debt maturities that are 1 trillion Kenya shillings, and that's on average about 10 million US dollars for our economy. As a result of us being at that level of surpassing the debt anchor, what the government has done is it is very keen not to default on the international front or on its debt obligation. But domestically, we've already restructured our bonds and even some of the bills so that those that were maturing within the next 3 to 5 years have been reorganized for longer maturity. And we are also not repaying our domestic suppliers. So people who supply goods and services to both the national level of government and the county level of government are not receiving their payment. And we have accumulated about 6 billion in pending bills to creditors who have done services or supplied goods to government. So we already have a form of default. What has been consistent as a form of default for we in the civil society, and what even triggered Kenyans last year to protest against any further domestic revenue mobilization, is the fact that our government has consistently and has now, it's now gotten very deep, defaulted on its services to the people. Our health services are coming to a halt. Our education services have grown. The cost of education has grown up to 10 times for some of the courses offered in our university. The capitation for basic education has declined and is consistently disbursed very, very late, because the amount, once we have done our debt servicing and then we've done the recurrent expenditure of paying for salaries and pensions, most of the time we are left with less than 10% to go into service delivery or even go to any forms of development processes. So that is just to paint the picture of where we are. And for Kenya, because of the fiscal space shrinking to that extent, we've even resorted to public-private partnerships, which are being resourced through some form of private bonds that then speak to that then even private investors are coming quickly to fill in the gap at what cost. So that is the picture that we have. And our government and the IMF in March mutually agreed to withdraw from the final review, the 9th review of the Kenya IMF programs, because nearly all the benchmarks had not been met, which is both a problem for us of the Kenyan government and the IMF having to wait until the 9th review for them to realize that this is not working and to rethink the model that they were rolling out for Kenya. I'll pause there, Annalise.
Thanks so much, Diana. It really is a grim picture for Kenya right now, but you and the organizations that you're working with are doing phenomenal work, and we're really happy that you're here this week in DC. And now, Kashif, over to you.
No, thanks, Annalise, and thank you everyone for joining. I'll also take this opportunity to give you a quick overview of what is going on in Pakistan. So in last year, September, the IMF approved a 37-month long extended fund facility program for Pakistan with a total amount of $7 billion. The key priorities and structural benchmarks under the EFF supported program that mandates the government of Pakistan to carry out macroeconomic level reforms, reforming key sectors of the economy, such as energy, strengthening public service delivery, building climate resilience, governance and anti-corruption institutions, and as well as reforming the fiscal revenues and fiscal measures. In last year or so, since the program has started, the Pakistan has implemented a number of reforms on, I believe, on some key fronts, especially on the DRM, the domestic resource mobilization. One of the key areas of risk here is really a tax to GDP ratio that has historically languished around 10% of the GDP. In the last year or so, it has increased to 10.5, and the idea, I think, under this program is to increase it to at least 13.5% of the GDP. To achieve this, there are efforts going on to sort of document the undocumented businesses, control the circulation of cash in the economy, and bring in the untaxed sectors such as agriculture or the sectors that are very low tax, such as real estate. For the first time in the last few months, Pakistan has introduced a legislation on agriculture tax, which remained untaxed despite its significant contribution to the economy. And then secondly, I believe under this program, the digitization is another important key area that has been being pushed by the IMF and also being adopted by the government of Pakistan, especially at the macro level among the key revenue institutions such as the Board of Revenue, the central bank, etc. But despite these efforts, the serious challenges of economic recovery at the same time, they also persist. In our view, these issues persist because they largely emanate from governance and transparency issues. So apart from the economic policy reforms, what we are focusing that there is also an imperative for restructuring on the governance fronts. This agenda is addressed by the IMF's the Extended Fund Facility Program, which requires some tangible measures to be implemented under the 5-year-long program. But in order to bring this governance and anti-corruption perspective on the forefront, what Transparency International Pakistan is doing, we are conducting a civil society-led governance and anti-corruption diagnostic assessment to assess the governance and transparency issues that require immediate short-term, long-term, and medium-term remedial measures with regard to governance, fiscal efficiency, institutional accountability, and another other key area on the revenue mobilization. Now, when we say, I think it's also important to emphasize, when we say governance and corruption vulnerabilities, the focus here really is on the foundational governance issues, without which the policies and plans for debt sustainability, economic recovery, they could be on the unsustainable grounds. And we have seen how the economies go through the shaky recovery, which may be unsustainable in the long run. So what we are doing through a wider consultation with the civil society, with professionals and the experienced individuals in different sectors, is to publish a series of evidence-based recommendations which focus on the economic governance structures and the accountability institutions to bridge these critical gaps. Now, some of the key areas of our focus are around the fiscal governance, around domestic resource mobilization, and around enhancing transparency and accountability of the public financial management system. And just to give you a quick overview of some of the areas that we are looking, and we can also talk about a bit in the follow-up question of what the key risks that the IMF is looking, is around the fiscal governance. And that fiscal governance, by that, we mean looking at the budget allocation processes. Essentially, there is a gap between the revenue and expenditure, how to enhance the capacity of the state institution to generate more revenue base. Again, that also links with the enhancing the capacity and again, the efficiency of the revenue collection bodies, taxing the untaxed sectors, such as real estate, the sectors that are also low taxed agriculture. How do we remove subsidies and reform the anomalous taxation system by reforming the state-owned entities? And the second key area of our focus is around the financial oversight. And within the financial oversight, again, the key focus here is if we want to ensure that the policies are sustainable and the economies are not trapped into the debt trap, the financial oversight is a key. And how do we enhance the role of the public accounts committees, the parliamentary oversight. And one way of doing it is to ensure that the countries publish their annual public debt reports. And this includes both domestic and foreign debts, the tax directories, beneficial owners registries, and reforming the market regulations and the financial sector. And thirdly, I think the key area here is on the rule of law, which is around strengthening the anti-corruption institutions, looking at the reforms within the recruitment processes, the capacity of these institutions to prosecute and convict the corrupt practices. And that links to broad issues that also come within the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, looking at procurement transparency, conflict of interest, and whistleblower protection. Now, all this exercise of governance and anti-corruption diagnostic assessment essentially focuses on reforming the legal frameworks as well as the institutional practices by putting in place the governance benchmarks that address the long-term economic betterment of the country. In doing so, I think what we are also trying to ensure is that the reforms must go well beyond the IMF agreement cycle, and they are implemented in a sustainable manner. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kashif. We can dive into some more of that during the Q&A. But just to close out this section, I'd like to mention one success story. Back in 2023, Transparency International US formed a transnational partnership with Transparency International Sri Lanka on advocacy around their respective IMF loan program. This was a year after the Sri Lankan economy collapsed due to financial mismanagement and corruption among top Sri Lankan leaders. Experts actually labeled it as the worst financial crisis in the country since its independence in 1948. And so in March 2023, the IMF approved a loan program worth about $2.9 billion to be dispersed over multiple years. And in conjunction with the program, the Sri Lankan government agreed to undergo the governance diagnostic exercise. It was actually the first country in Asia to undergo this type of exercise. And TI Sri Lanka, in coordination with a number of other organizations in the country, released a shadow diagnostic to coincide with the publication of the IMF's. Our colleagues there routinely met with IMF missions, and we were pleased to see that 14 out of the 16 recommendations contained in the IMF's governance diagnostic were actually included as conditionality in the loan program. So we're continuing to work with them to monitor the implementation of these commitments. I think that plays into a larger set of recommendations that we have presented to the US representation to the IMF. We're advocating for a much stronger focus on governance and curbing corruption, and would like to see that the US representation push to ensure that governments receiving loans are making specific, measurable, and time-bound commitments to strengthen government and public financial management as part of the agreements. The IMF should be engaging in-country experts throughout loan programs to better inform IMF staff assessments of priorities and gaps in implementation, and they should continue to use their existent channels to elevate these issues, including conducting and publishing more country-specific governance diagnostics and adopting the recommendations included in these as program conditionality. To assist with outside monitoring, we would like to see the IMF clearly state expectations by including a list of structural benchmarks or program conditionality included in loan programs on their country pages, and hold governments accountable to those expectations. We think this would really strengthen the work of the IMF and lead to more success stories. We'd like to see this attention on curbing corruption and strengthening governments paid to in the Sri Lanka program become a model for other countries, which is why our colleagues from Kenya and Pakistan are joining us for the spring meetings this week. I really enjoyed working with everyone on this call in trying to reach that goal. So now I'm going to pose a question to each of our panelists to get the ball rolling, and then we'll open it up to a larger Q&A. Panelists, if you all wouldn't mind trying to keep your responses to 2 to 3 minutes. And Daniela, if I can start with you. I joined Daniela's panel at the IMF yesterday on hidden debt, and it was really great. The room was packed, so was the overflow room, and I can see why. I think again, it's a really timely discussion, and not enough people are talking about it. And so Daniela, just to start, I'm wondering if you could provide a good example of real world impact or consequences, the impact of hidden debt.
Great. No, thank you very much for that, Annalise. And yeah, I think also Diana and Kashif have also touched a bit on the risk and this interplay of the impact between corruption and hidden debt. But maybe, and since you mentioned the event yesterday, I'll start with the case of hidden debt and this interplay between corruption and debt, which is the hidden debt or the tuna bond loan scandal in Mozambique. Several of you may know, this is the case that we generally use to exemplify what is the interplay between corruption and debt and sustainability and fiscal crisis. So what happened in the case in Mozambique was a mixture between corruption practices in the contraction or in the acquisition of debt, as well as these drivers that we were discussing before of a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability that enable the corruption case to happen, and that basically led the country to one of the worst macroeconomic crises that they have faced also since independence, and that had an impact directly on most of its population, leading to more than 40% of the population to be under the line of poverty. So what happened in the case of Mozambique was that between 2012 and 2016, Credit Suisse, a Swiss bank, lent $1.3 billion, approximately 12% of the country's GDP, in a loan to support the maritime industry in Mozambique. This was a scheme that was developed by the then Ministry of Finance and the government of Mozambique, jointly with some officials at Credit Suisse and another bank known as Private Investment Group, based also in the country. This scheme also led to the development or to the creation of a state-owned enterprise, which was the one receiving the loan, and which was basically the one in charge of managing it. The scheme involved payment of bribes of over $200 million to the Private Investment Group and over $50 million to Credit Suisse. But what that meant was also a $0 for the population or for the people in Mozambique. After that, the debt or the loan was hidden, so it was not published, it was not disclosed, and was also contracted without the approval of the parliament in the country. Years after, the IMF and other lenders in the country discovered or were aware of the loan, which increased in approximately 1.4 billion the amount of debt that was contracted by the country, and decided to pull out of the country, to cancel all of the lending programs that they had, as well as also to cancel from other bilateral governments the official development aid that was given to the country. And what this meant, as I said at the beginning, was the country going to one of the worst macroeconomic crises that have also been seen in the continent. And with a toll, approximately in terms of financial losses, of approximately $11 billion for the country, from which the population, as I was saying before, didn't receive a dollar. What we're seeing, or there are a lot of lessons learned from the case of Mozambique, starting from this interplay between corruption and how the scheme happened even in the negotiations and the contraction of debt itself, but how, as we're saying before, this lack of transparency and accountability and oversight from the parliament and other institutions was the one that enabled also the hidden debt scandal. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that this is not stopping from happening. So last year in 2024, in Senegal, an audit from the Office of the Auditor General discovered that approximately a big percentage of the loans in Senegal were not being disclosed or were not being published. And this has led to different debt levels and deficits. Now the IMF has decided to restructure and to review all the lending process into the country, and the conversations are still ongoing. But approximately what was discovered by this audit made by the Office of the Auditor General is that the former president hid or concealed approximately $7 billion between 2019 and 2024. So what we're seeing is that even though we had the case in Mozambique, which really showed which are the costs of corruption in the fiscal stability of the country, these cases are still happening. It's happening in Senegal. You mentioned the case of Sri Lanka, and now I think Diana would also deepen a bit into the conversations that are happening in Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And just if folks on this call are not familiar with the tuna bond scandal, it's a sobering but worthwhile deep dive. I encourage everyone here to read more about it. But now I'm going to turn over to Diana. Diana, the question that I want to pose for you is that Kenya is kind of the hot topic right now at the IMF spring meetings. Kenya is trying to negotiate a new loan after its most recent, as you mentioned, $3.6 billion program was prematurely terminated. So what are the implications for Kenya if they aren't able to negotiate a new program with the IMF? You're on mute. Hopefully you can still hear and see me. Still can't hear you, but if we want, I could turn it over to Kashif first. Kashif, if you're ready to answer a question. Earlier this year, so you had an IMF mission visit your country to examine the severity of corruption and governance vulnerabilities across core state functions, the governance diagnostic exercise. Um, what are the top one or two risks that you think they'll identify and press the Pakistani government to address in
So the IMF mission has had a number of visits to Pakistan, and based on the discussion that is in the public, and also the discussion that we have had with the mission, I think they are particularly looking at the overall shortcomings within the governance structures. One of the key risks is obviously around the anti-corruption agencies, and looking at the fragmented authorities of different bodies and their capacity to punish the corrupt practices. So I think on the anti-corruption side, the focus has really been on enhancing the key anti-corruption agencies to address both the public and private sector corruption. And this also, I think, aligns with pushing for some amendments within our public procurement rules and systems to end exemptions for direct contracting, as well as also the focus on enhancing the implementation of access to information legislation and its effective implementation. Finally, I think within the anti-corruption space, another important area that is being pushed upon is on the auditing institutions, the Auditor General, the Public Accounts Committee, the parliamentary oversight, and how its role can be strengthened to ensure that the public funds and the loan funds are prudently spent. Secondly, I think the focus is also largely on the DRM, the domestic resource mobilization, to address a revenue deficit. The focus here, I think, is both on enhancing the revenue based through documentation of businesses, through putting in place the penalties for bringing in different sectors under the tax net, and also the focus is also on cutting down on expenditures. So there is a focus on reforming the loss-making entities, the bodies which are doing a duplication work, and we yet have to see the data on how such reforms will bring in terms of the revenue targets that the IMF and the government of Pakistan is focusing on. But these are two key areas that are certainly being identified as part of the governance and anti-corruption diagnostic assessment, and also the key areas that we are also looking at as part of our civil society assessment.
Great, thank you so much, Kashif. Now, Diana, I see you're unmuted now. Back over to you. If you could speak a little bit, about the implications if a deal can't be reached.
Thank you very much, Annalise. And it's whether a deal can be reached, or when it's reached, it's not a win-win situation for Kenya, whichever way we go. So first and foremost, if a deal is reached, it would be there's some good in it because one, most of the IMF programs and the structural benchmarks that are usually incorporated have a way of incorporating a certain level of discipline. But unfortunately, most of the times that is not followed through. We are just from one such program, everything around reducing the fiscal deficit, how we borrow, restructuring our state-owned enterprises, reducing the cost of government. All those were not adhered to. But the one thing that is for sure is that credit availed by particularly the IMF and the World Bank is far much cheaper than most of the other loans that we acquire, syndicated loans, particularly from the bond market and even from some bilateral countries. Based on where we are as a country, the global markets have flagged us, like I said, as a high-risk country. All credit ratings they don't give us a good rating. So if you're not able to negotiate another program with the IMF, then we have to survive on borrowing very, very expensively. If we manage to negotiate with the IMF and get a program, and we negotiate with the IMF without IMF restructuring or recalibrating how they negotiate with countries like Kenya, they will come and will focus only on revenue mobilization. Like I said, targets were not met, including revenue mobilization. But as the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, we often hold that Kenya does not have a revenue problem because our revenue has consistently grown. We may not be achieving the targets to resource a bloated government budget that has so many unnecessary budget vote heads and budgeted corruption in there. Our revenue grows. So if the new IMF program comes and focuses purely on revenue mobilization across the sectors that have the highest, they go for where you get numbers. So that is why our government has resorted to increasing value-added tax, which is a consumption tax, and that affects everybody, income tax and that revenue only goes to repaying loans, not services. If that happens, then you can be sure there will be the Kenyan people will rise up against that. So the program we design moving forward for Kenya will need to be one that restructures the loans, rethinks revenue mobilization, and ultimately works on expenditure that does not deepen inequities and inequalities of the citizens when it comes to access to services. So either or it will be tricky. We may also be looking, if we don't get into an IMF program, we continue borrowing Diana to pay Annalise. We are on the verge of default, and the restructuring process, who will oversee that on behalf of both the domestic and international creditors, that Kenya owes. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. And this is just a reminder to everyone else, since we are going to open it up now. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. I see that there are 2 questions that are already posed. So Diana, if I can actually keep the spotlight on you, there's one question in the chat, and it's around experts have pointed out that there are massive irregularities in state-funded projects, some of them cited in Auditor General reports, suggesting almost budgeted corruption. Would you be able to give some examples of those?
Okay, yes, Kenya is surely a good case study for where there's hidden debt and hidden costs. I'll highlight one recent one where we shifted from a national health insurance fund to a social health insurance fund that saw us increase the contribution across people who have different levels of income, but the contribution grew by between 200% to 400%. That particular social health insurance fund is being managed by a non-line system. The cost of that particular system was budgeted at 104.8 billion Kenya shillings, which is about 10 million USD for just a single system, for one single system. And that cost is 10 times higher than the cost we were using for the National Health Insurance Fund. Who owns that particular system? It is not even owned in Kenya, yet we have very, very good capacity, both within government and within our national research institution to develop a system. And we didn't even need to develop one. If there was additional uptake of that, all we needed was to strengthen and improve our system. So that is one that shouts and screams, and our digital public infrastructure is just one of those. We've had a number of other projects. Most of them are linked to procurement, and one long-standing one that has been on for about 10 years is the managed medical equipment schemes that was used to procure medical equipment for counties, for the national government. And it was annoyingly hilarious that some counties, let me just paint the picture, is a county would go for, say, an MRI machine. They would be given an MRI machine. They have no room that can fit that, yet this machine has already been procured on a list. So they must construct a room that fits that. So those are the types of corruption scandals that we are looking at. And they are both on the budget, the government budget, but also on development of other critical infrastructure. Another recent one was the deal to upgrade our biggest airport, the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, by the Adani group of companies. That one was procured at very high cost in a very irregular way. People raised the issues. There were other bidders that would have given us better terms, been less extractive, but they were set aside. And it took a lot of public outcry, pushback, even judicial decision. And the government nearly ignored all that, both the executive and parliament. And I think the final nail was when that particular group was implicated and charged formally in the United States for acts of corruption and bribery. We have a number of budgeted corruption that are funded by the Chinese government, where the government has gone ahead and has received loan debt contracts to develop dams and other roads, bridges, including the road Kimwerel. Then those particular projects are not completed. Why? On account of corruption. This is known to the government, and this is also known to the lender. And the lender goes ahead and gives new credit to do the very same project that they had offered money without demanding any form of accountability. So those are some of the instances that have caused us as a Kenyan people to say we have an expenditure problem, we have a bad political culture, we have political leaders who are not fit for purpose, and they are the reason why we are continually in this particular mess. And this has been exposed both by the Okoa Uchumi Coalition and by our journalist. I see one of them online. He's now very global, Ramayang. I know he's done some amazing work on this as well.
Thanks, Diana. We have 10 minutes left and we have a bunch of questions in the chat. And so what I'm going to try to do, maybe Daniela, I can throw one at you if you could try to keep your remarks as short as possible. And then there are, I think, 2 for Kashif. So Daniela, what commitments is TI expecting to see implemented to close the loopholes for corruption in debt contraction and management?
Thank you very much for this, Annalise. I'll try to be as concrete and as fast as possible. So before starting to go into detail into the commitments that we would like to see implemented, you already mentioned a couple, and I think both Diana and Kashif have mentioned as well at the national level. But we are in a very timely moment, not only because of the global debt crisis that we're facing and the relevance of discussing these issues, but as well as in the framework of the negotiations and conversations that are happening globally. One of them, of course, the fourth Financing for Development agenda, as well as ongoing conversations in the framework of G20 meetings of my finance ministers. And then in this sense, and I'm also going to piggyback a bit in one of the questions that was also raised in terms of what is the lender's responsibility. In many cases, when we're discussing about corruption or fighting corruption, closing the loopholes for corruption in debt management, there is a big focus on borrowing countries, which of course we need to enhance governance systems. I think as Diana was mentioning, not only focusing on higher resource mobilization, but also on how to strengthen public financial management frameworks to guarantee that all those resources that are being mobilized, either by increased taxes or either by loans, are protected and basically achieve the outcomes that they are set for. But on the other hand, there is the responsibility and the commitments that we're expecting from the lender side that are not necessarily as much discussed. And then in this, I think there are 3 main areas where we would like to focus. So the first one, as I was mentioning, is trying to close some of those drivers that enhance corruption in public debt, both contraction and management. And the first one of these would be on increasing transparency. So basically, we need to know who is lending, under which conditions, and to whom. And here we're not only talking about, of course, public lenders or international financial institutions such as the IMF or the World Bank, but we're also talking about private lenders, which were one of the main characters in the case of Mozambique. And in here, what we're expecting lenders to do is, on one hand, to enhance cooperation in sharing debt-related information and sharing information, also including other more complex instruments, as we were saying before. So not only traditional loans, but also including information on contingent liabilities, information on swaps, including climate or environmental debt swaps, among others. And on the other hand, and this is something that we have achieved as part of the For Financing for Development first outcome document, and we hope to really manage to include it, and is to have a global registry on sovereign debt. So basically having a centralized registry where we can see lenders and borrower countries, but also civil society organizations can see who is giving which loans to whom and under which conditions. The second main area that we would like to focus in is on developing anti-corruption reforms. So I already mentioned how do we need to strengthen public financial management frameworks, but also as mentioned by Diana before, we also need lenders to be responsible in terms of their due diligence processes, and also understand how corruption should also be one of the drivers and main variables that should be included as a component of their debt sustainability assessments when they are analyzing and seeing the feasibility of giving a new loan to a country. And then finally, on the lender side, we want to focus on how we can ensure the meaningful participation and consultancy of civil society organizations. So we're very happy and we applaud the initiatives that have been developed around governance diagnosis, but as we saw it in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, and also in Kenya, in many cases, these governance diagnoses are being developed without a significant participation and consultation with civil society organizations or organizations also working in good governance and anti-corruption issues. That's why in Sri Lanka and now also in Pakistan, we're developing a shadow or a parallel governance diagnosis that would fit into that. And we hope that as part of the conversations with the IMF, so the recommendations developed are included. And finally, just on the domestic accountability side, because I know we don't have a lot of time, so I already mentioned the need to really strengthen public financial management frameworks, basically to guarantee that all resources and public funds mobilized are used in a transparent, accountable, and straight manner. But also, as we were mentioning before, we need specific and concrete actions to guarantee oversight of debt contraction and debt management, and this includes working with parliaments as working with supreme audit institutions to develop performance audits of debt, as well as empowering civil society to monitor and oversee this process. But maybe I'll leave it here for now, and of course, happy to follow up the conversations afterwards.
Thanks so much, Daniela. I'm going to plug also the report that she co-authored, again, Debt Disclosed, a civil society checklist for debt transparency and accountability. Such a well-researched and well-thought-out report. It should be mandatory reading for every government. And now, Kashif, I want to turn it over to you to sort of close us out. There are quite a few questions for you in the chat. I was trying to figure out what would probably be most interesting to raise. But I'll pose too, see how much time we have. But first, do you see political will or institutional readiness to undertake deep structural reforms in the areas that you talked about under the current loan agreement? And then also, how can civil society play a better watchdog role in ensuring that these reforms aren't just kind of like, check the box on a piece of paper?
No, thanks for this question. And I think this question has come up in a lot of other discussions as well, that because essentially these reforms that as a civil society we are pushing, they rely at the end the political will of the government, and also the political will in terms of that they are not short term, they remain there in the long term. But I think in terms of the opportunity, so because whenever the governments are in economic crisis, they need cash, and that's a very good window of opportunity to get the reforms across. So I think at the moment there is in Pakistan, there's a good window of opportunity, both from the political and administrative will to get these reforms across. On the civil society participation, again, this is, I think, very important that we have also highlighted in our discussions with these stakeholders, because often the IMF-led governance diagnostic assessment, they are the state-led process. These are the diagnostics that are done by the ministries themselves, followed under the IMF delegation. So the civil society voice is missing. And the civil society perspective, I think it sort of brings those real issues to the forefront that are often missing from the official narratives. One of the way is to push at the level of the IMF and World Bank. There's a need to engage more civil society in these consultations. And then thirdly, I think so the shadow support that we are doing, we're trying to ensure that we bring across the board stakeholders to come up with reforms that are tangible and concrete in form of recommendations. And thirdly, I think the civil society has a very important watchdog role when it comes to the loan programs and the implementation. And one of the things that we are pushing is the publication of the debt information. There should be annual debt reports so that the ordinary citizens, the CSOs, know what obligations are there and how the legal obligations that the government has mandated to implement. So the CSOs can play an oversight role on that. And that, I think, comes largely in every conversation that we have had today, whether it's the auditing institutions, whether it's the implementation of policies, the CSO's oversight is key over there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kashif. And thank you to the rest of our panelists and for everyone coming today. I hope you found this a really enlightening and informative discussion. I'm sure anyone here would be happy for any kind of follow-up. If you want to reach out, you have their names. Hopefully your contact information is not too difficult to find online. But again, I just want to thank everyone for coming today. I think again, as I sort of opened with it, it's a really timely discussion. A lot of eyes are on the IMF and the World Bank right now in the spring meetings. And so, yeah, please follow up with any additional questions offline. Appreciate you all coming.